there was a question since we're starting the live stream. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. There was a question: can women be in a position of sultan or sultana or even a khalifa? Okay, there was a debate between scholars on that matter. So I'll just make the story short. The first thing, like we said earlier, the situation that we're living in is in such chaos that whether we have a sultana or whether we have a sultan, right now is not the debate whether it's a female or a male that is bringing the change. We need to make the change regardless of who makes the change, or
Right.
whether it's called khilafa, or whether it's called sultanate, or whether it's called a federation. At the end of the day, we recognize that. There's no question about that piece of it. But then the other question, at least historically, that was asked was, can women actually be in a position of leadership? And what type of leadership we're talking about? We're talking about different types of leadership. The first one is called al-wilaya al-uzma, which basically means the great or the grand position of authority. So we're talking about positions where they would make law and order. They would basically be the ones to make the decisions regarding maybe international issues, maybe within the country. We're speaking about issues that relate to money, that relate to war, that relate to so many different things that basically a president or a king would basically do. So no scholar, no Muslim scholar, as of what I know, had ever said that a woman can be a khalifa. Okay. Yet, there were instances in history that women did get into that position, just as shajarat al-dur. Okay, shajarat al-dur, well, Khayzaran as well, was the key leading figure to control. Okay, but their Ryan and their control wasn't necessarily something that Islam approved of. Or at least when I say Islam, I mean by that, including Muslim scholars. And they went against Shajarat al-Dur and said, well, this is not even allowed. Okay. As for the evidences that they had used, you basically consider number one, an ayah. الرجال قوامون على النساء. And many scholars said العبرة بعموم اللفظ إلا بخصوص السبب. What does the word mean anyways? Now, one is that the sentence الرجال, men, are قوامون على النساء, on women. When you look at the word قوامون, they said, well, the word قوام means to be in authority, means to be superior, means to be a supporter, means to be in a position where this person is responsible. And they said, certainly, this ayah was more directed at husband and wife, let's call it the pyramid within the household, but they said not necessarily to be only within that. They said certainly the ayah continues فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ, and in the beginning it also said بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. So the context was definitely in relationship to household, let's call it status and position and that kind of management. But they said, when you look at الرجال قوامون على النساء, although it's part of an ayah and not necessarily taking the whole ayah, they said this ayah is also to be applied in all the, let's call it management, or at least in all the type of distribution. If you're talking about a household, that she's not the one that the Lord Almighty considers considered that she is qualified to be the leader within the household, then how are we going to say that she's qualified to be a leader within a bigger household, which is a country? So that was the first evidence that they used. They said, الرجال قوامون على النساء. They said it's a jumla ismiya. What does that mean? It means that it's not giving me some kind of a verb that would show and be indicative of a movement or a motion of something that it depends on what happens, but it basically gave me an informative clause. An informative clause is giving me a fact. That was the first opinion. That was the first evidence. The second evidence that they used, they said in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ had said, لا يفلح قوم ولوا أمرهم امرأة. That any group of people, they would not be successful if they had put a woman to be in the position of leadership or in the position of this woman leading them. Now, there were almost 19 different narrations for this hadith. Not only narrations, but including various interpretations. The first interpretation basically said, well, this is not necessarily as an informative clause or a clause that's telling me that any group of people that put a woman to be the leader, then therefore there's no way they're going to be successful. And their defense was, hey, we've got an ayah for this. What is it? They said, well, remember in Surah Saba, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us about the queen of Saba that was in that position of leadership and how she basically was asking her people, and she wasn't a dictator, and then she made the right decision, followed Prophet Sulaiman and all of that. Then here we go. Quran would also tell us that, hey, she's a sign of success, a sign of a woman that led her people to Tawheed, and she was also not a dictator and actually did the right thing. So the scholars, and particularly the scholar that actually said that opinion, is Ibn Hazm. What was he saying? Well, he suggested that this ayah is exclusive to the context that this hadith was said in. What was the context? So the context was in the Persian Empire. The leader, their king, actually was killed by his own son. And then the son was also killed, and there was only to be basically the one to take over the throne was the queen, his daughter. She took over that dynasty, and the Prophet ﷺ said that statement at that time. So some scholars debated, just like Ibn Hazm, they said, well, the context of this hadith is relating to that woman in particular and giving us to this prophecy that the Persian Empire's last dynasty is basically that female queen, or that queen, that female leader. Okay, so was that the case? And indeed, by the way, she was the last dynasty. And the Prophet ﷺ basically had foretold about that. The second opinion, they said, no. لا يفلح قوم ولوا أمرهم امرأة. They said this is a generalized statement and is a comprehensive statement, and therefore this is to include any group of people that would put a woman to be their leader will not get into success. Why? So then they use another type of evidence. The third type of evidence, they said, well, of course, they didn't have neuroscience, they didn't have, psychology studies or all these different things, but they did have something that you can see psychology today, neuroscience today is also speaking about. But the evidence that they were using at the time was more of their, let's call it anecdotal, their own experience. They basically had observed human behavior and observed women behavior and male behavior, and they said women are showing more signs that they are built to relate to emotions. And therefore, if we're speaking about somebody that was built, meaning their own instinct, their own, I guess, psychology, they didn't use the word psychology per se, but they were talking about fitra. They were speaking into an inclination of how women and how men were different in their behavior, in their inclination. They didn't necessarily know why and what dictated, their behavior and all the different things that we would see in neuroscience. In neuroscience, it is basically giving me certain scans and telling me, well, this is what we're seeing a woman's anatomy and brain anatomy is looking like, and this is what we're seeing in terms of hormones, this is what we're seeing in terms of biological and physiological changes, and even psychological changes comparing men to women. But at the time, they didn't see that. They just saw the implication of it. So based on that, they basically said, well, our other evidence is that women are more of emotional beings, and therefore positions of governance is supposed to contain not necessarily the focus or the potential of emotion. It's supposed to have the potential of, one, pragmatic decision-making, two, authoritative decision-making, in other words, authority, precision, and this type of mindset. So they regarded that women's mindset is not capable or designed to be in a position of such leadership. They considered that they were too emotional. So whether you want to call it anecdotal, you want to call it psychological, whatever it is you want to call it, this is their other evidence. And that's why in the books of fiqh, then they go deeper into that debate. If we say women are inclined to emotion and therefore cannot be in a position of wilaya, they said, hey, if she cannot be a wali over herself in a situation of marriage, then how is it that I'm going to allow her to be the wali over the whole society if the Lord Almighty did not give her the wilaya over her own self in decision-making about her future in marriage? Then how are we going to consider that she's qualified to be the decision maker for the whole society's future? So those debates, and of course, the other side of the debate, hold on, let me give you the other side of the debate. The other side of the debate didn't actually have a lot of scholars. It's mainly modern scholars. Some modern scholars, I would say, were definitely influenced by Western thought. And you had, whether Muhammad Abdo, you had some modern scholars that felt that, there's room for reinterpreting the traditional text. And through this reinterpretation, we can find traces of different areas where we can improve, quote unquote, our interpretation to make it something that is inclusive. So you had modern, let's call it modern Muslim interpretation that allowed and considered that it's permissible, it's allowed, and therefore women can be in those positions. There's nothing in the text that forbids so, and they tried to modify the data, try to reinterpret the evidences by saying, well, here's the context of this, or trying to get it out of perhaps the interpretation that the scholars of fiqh had put it in, at least in the past. And they said that that interpretation wasn't necessarily fully unbiased, and that it was an influence of a lot of misogyny. They considered that that interpretation was more misogynistic and not necessarily an objective interpretation. But here's one thing. When you look at those interpretations, it's very hard to claim that your interpretation is completely unbiased and it doesn't contain any influence, okay? And think that to be liberal is to be unbiased, which is very dangerous to say. To be liberal or to get in Western influence is not at all saying that you are unbiased, but you are biased towards the Western or the liberal interpretation of things. But a Muslim, in order to make sure that we would have an interpretation based on the text, you are safer to go back to the traditional interpretation that scholars had approved of. We're talking about scholars of the previous scholars, the scholars that had their deen and their taqwa, and certainly their academics and their professionalism was at a higher level than what we see today. That's the other thing. Number two, if we are going to use this card and doubt their intention, that, oh, they were misogynist, they were anti-women and all of that, if we're going to be using that wild card every single time that we would see that it doesn't go in congruence and doesn't match the Western definition of where and what women should be in, then we're going to be using that wild card in each and every single corner, and we're going to be reinterpreting everything about the religion and bringing this wild card of misogyny each and every single time, maybe in ibadat, maybe in muamalat, and the list is going to go on. And then you're going to go to even the farthest end and even claim, just like Amina Wadud, that even claim that the Quran to be a misogynist revelation. You can go really far and end up in kufr. So at the end is that embracing the scholars' note, and that was approved by the scholars, is always safest. Now, the other thing I would like to say is that scholars then debated what between something called al-wilaya al-khassa and wilaya al-amma. What does that mean? So we're talking about, let's say, an inclusive wilaya, and we're talking about inclusive wilaya, we're talking about a major wilaya, comprehensive wilaya, we're talking about something like the khilafah. But if we're talking about wilaya khasa, we're talking about she is the CEO of, let's say, some major company in real estate or a major company in computers or whatever it is. Can a woman be in wilaya khasa like that? Okay, that's also a place of debate between scholars. The very, let's say, extreme view, they considered that no, she cannot be in that position. And the more lenient view, and I don't mean by lenient to be condescending here, but I'm just, saying those different opinions. The second opinion said, well, it doesn't matter. It's permissible for her to be in that position, even if men are working for her, because we had positions where Sayyida Khadija, she had an employee and it was male employees that were working for her. So therefore, there's nothing haram with a woman being in walaya khassa or in a specific, let's say, executive director, CEO of a company, etc. This isn't relating something that requires, let's say, major decision making in war, in politics, and so many different issues that relate to people's lives. This is relating to, let's say, company in business, or a company in maybe a hospital. She's the head of that hospital, whatever it is. That's going to be limited to her expertise, and therefore it's an issue of her qualification that's going to determine whether she is qualified to run that company. And just as she can run her own money, and then of course she could be the CEO of that company, it doesn't matter. All right. But then if she is going to be, let's say, running within office, and we're talking about her being in a position where it's going to affect the lives, we're talking about the lives, we're talking about major decisions. That's where majority of the scholars, only Ibn Hazm was the one to really debate to that extent. And you want to remember Ibn Hazm, he said last time that he was taught by women. So shaykhat were really his main and first teachers. It was shaykhat in fiqh, shaykhat in tafsir, shaykhat in nahu, you name it. Okay, so most of his teachers were women, and that might explain a lot of the pro-women, I guess, views that Ibn Hazm had, including this one, including another interpretation that Ibn Hazm had, which is that women can also be prophets, which all the other scholars had totally rejected. And his claim was that, hey, أوحينا إلى أم موسى. Here it is. He said, أوحينا إلى أم موسى, then Musa was getting wahi. And Sayyida Maryam, Jibreel came to her, and Jibreel talked to her numerous times. She got miracles, and therefore, here we go, she's a prophet. All the other scholars, they rejected that, and they said, well, they're actually salihin and not necessarily anbiya. What's the evidence? They said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أوحى ربك إلى النحل. Are you going to say that the bee, this nahla, that this bee is going to be a prophet? Absolutely not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives wahi for the clouds. Does that mean they're prophets? There are different kinds of wahi, and every wahi would basically be understood based on the context that it is in. So just wanted to give just an overview, since, I was jokingly saying that I discovered that my last name, being Turkish, or actually Uthmani, and that it originates from a place in Ankara in Turkey. Okay. And even though, being Palestinian, but we were always told that we were Turkish descent. We were always told that we were Turkish descent. So I asked my Turkish students, and I said, hey, can you figure out where my name comes from? And they said it comes from Ankara, and it's Uthmani. So you never know. I jokingly said, maybe I'm the missing sultana, and maybe I might go to Erdogan and say, excuse me, sir, this is my spot. And probably lead the ummah into, all right, lead the ummah into figuring out, I guess, the situation in the Middle East. But yeah, of course, I was just joking about it. Okay, we're going to get to our tafsir right there, inshallah. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to stop this one. And just give me a second, because this is a completely different